The 1970s. An era of disco, big hair, and even bigger dances, and so much more. It's almost hard to believe it's been over 50 years since the decade started, and yet here we are in 2024, looking back and saying, wow, people lived in that time and actually survived. But all jokes aside, there are some things from that period that we can take for granted these days due to certain technologies and advancements. So allow me to show you 10 things from the 1970s that are gone forever. But before I begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe so we can keep enjoying these memories together. Number 10. Pong. Now I know today we have numerous kinds of video games to play across multiple systems, but in the early days of gaming, we had Pong, and it was awesome. Now I know it's hard to imagine, but there was a time before video games where we were doing things like board games and going outside to play. But once Pong showed up, it became a whole new experience. And let no one tell you any different, because it was fantastic and it could be difficult. Without Pong, we would not have many of the gaming innovations we have today. It's true, you could find an original Pong to play, and there are even modern Atari systems to allow you to play classic games just like it, but it's just not the same. Number 9. Special Services. In today's day and age, it's never been easier to find someone or something to do a service for you. But back in the 1970s, it was a way of life that specific people and places did things for you, and sometimes without even asking. For example, we may not have milkmen anymore because you can get milk in a variety of ways, but there was once a time where you could simply ask for the milkman to deliver you some milk, and they would do it with a smile and simply drop it off on your doorstep. Or if you were a parent, you could leave your baby's dirty diapers on the front porch, and someone would take them and leave clean ones behind. It's technically more convenient to do things for yourself or use certain apps to make those deliveries for you, but it's also more complicated than just calling the milkman for aid. Number 8. Encyclopedias. Here's another one that I'm sure you're happy about in terms of advancement. When people were stumped about something in the past, like in the 1970s, they didn't have computers with the internet to go to. If they needed an answer, they either had to phone someone who may know, or had to look it up in a book like the Encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia Britannica were standard fare in many homes, and they delivered a wide array of topics for you and others to enjoy and learn about. To be fair, these books are not gone, but the idea of them being your first and best resource to get your information has long since passed. It's easier to look things up online than it is in books, and yes, we should all be glad the information is easier to access. Number 7. Old school grocery products. Food changes with the times, but do you realize how much that it's changed over time? In the 1970s, some of the things we take for granted today had a much different kind of shelf life. For example, plastic pop bottles like 2 liters were invented in the 1970s, but before then, you had glass bottles that you had to go and refill. That's why the glass bottles are collector's items for some these days. Or how about TV dinners? Today you can just heat them up in the microwave without a care in the world, but in the 1970s you had to use the oven, and the dinners were more expansive in their offerings than some are today. And if that's not enough for you, there was once a time when things like Wonder Bread had trading cards inside. And that's certainly one way to get children to eat bread. Things are much more diverse and easier to make now, but some of the charm and proportions have definitely been lost. Number 6. Rabbit ears. In the 1970s, television did not have the best signal reception. The massive blocks that TVs were back in those days had something called a rabbit ear antenna. People often had to adjust them on the fly in order to ensure that they were tapping into the airwaves that brought them their pictures and sounds. It became a trope that sometimes you had to have someone move the ears while the others in the room watched the TV to see if things got better or worse. And thankfully, we don't have to have that anymore. We do still have problems with television, but it's sometimes easier to fix than having to move the ears around. Number 5. The format of music and movies. Here's one that has simply evolved from the 1970s but is still technically prevalent today. In the 1970s, you didn't have one method of listening to music or watching movies, you actually had several. In the case of music, there were vinyl records you could play via your record player to enjoy for however long that lasted, but there were also 8-track players and cassettes that grew in popularity during that time. And as for movies, it was the decade of the VHS tape, and even a precursor to DVDs today. Now we have DVDs, digital music downloads, and streaming services, so the variety may still be there, it just comes in a different format. Number 4. Smoking. In the 1970s, smoking was widespread and socially accepted and prevalent in popular culture all throughout movies, television shows, and advertisements. Cigarette commercials often depicted smoking as a symbol of sophistication and success. It was a common thing in social settings, which included restaurants, offices, airplanes, and even hospitals. And people would often smoke indoors, with non-smokers having limited options for avoiding secondhand smoke. This lack of restrictions normalized smoking within the daily life. However, the 1970s also marked changing attitudes towards smoking. Health advocacy groups promoted greater public awareness and changes in policy, and the Surgeon General's warnings on cigarette packs began to influence public perception. By the end of the decade, the harmful effects of smoking were more widely recognized, setting the stage for the anti-smoking campaigns of the 1980s and beyond. Number 3. Automobiles. While some would argue that the style of the 1970s vehicles are better than today, it's unquestionable that modern cars are far more advanced and then some. For example, one of the biggest differences between modern cars and cars of the past is its transmission. Today, most cars in America have automatic transmissions, while in the past, the stick shift was quite the popular model, meaning you had to manually shift gears to keep the car from stalling. And furthermore, there were different ways of doing things, such as starting your car in the winter, or turning on your lights, and even air conditioning was not a guaranteed thing at times. You could also say that the safety features in many of these vehicles were not the best, as many now standard features in cars weren't even possible in the 1970s. And when it comes to gas mileage, the vehicles of today definitely have the vehicles of yesteryear beat. In spite of all these things, many people not only cherish their vehicles from the 1970s, but some are now hailed as some of the holy grail rides that must be collected and preserved. Like many things on this list, cars evolve with the times, and it's pretty cool to see just how far that we've come. Number 2. Truly classic television shows. Now, I love television, it doesn't matter what era that it's from, and it wouldn't take me long to point out all of the classic shows from the 1970s that are still far and above what's on TV today. Things like Three's Company, MASH, The Jeffersons, All in the Family, Columbo, Happy Days, Little House on the Prairie, Good Times, and The Muppet Show, and I could keep going on and on and on. But that's not to say that television these days is without value, as there are great things to watch. But in the 1970s, it was the golden age, with not a single Kardashian in sight. Number 1. Phones. Now, likely as not, you're probably watching this video on your phone. It's a popular thing to do, while the rest of you may have it close by in case you get something like a text message or an important phone call. But in the 1970s, this simply was not an option at all. At best, you had a phone that was on a cord that you could pull from its resting place so that you could sit while you talked, and at worst, it was on the wall and you had limited mobility. It's hard to picture an age without your cell phone, but it was once a thing, and it arguably was better back then because we weren't all looking at screens all the time, and people actually talked to each other in a more personal way versus just texting or calling when we were free. And there you have it, a look at some of the things from the 1970s that simply aren't around anymore or have been upgraded over the years. Do you wish that some of these things were still around and popular today, or are you glad that they've been left behind? Be sure to leave your thoughts below in the comments section and let me know what else from the 70s that you think is gone forever. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so that we can keep on reliving these memories together. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.